Psychiatry is integrating classic psychedelics to treat resistant neuropsychiatric disorders. Compounds like psilocybin and LSD demonstrate high efficacy in resolving symptoms resisting conventional pharmacotherapy. The neurobiological target responsible for these outcomes is well documented. Classic psychedelics act primarily through the agonism of the 5-HT2A receptor in the brain. This receptor activation triggers what researchers call acute subjective effects, or ASE. These are the profound alterations in perception, cognition, and mood that dominate the first few hours following administration. A deep division exists in the current psychiatric literature, summarized in a 2024 review by Therapeutic and colleagues. The debate centers on a single question: are these intense subjective effects causally linked to the patient's long-term clinical improvement? One side of the debate argues that the phenomenological experience, the trip itself, is merely an epiphenomenon. Under this model, the altered state of consciousness is simply a secondary byproduct of the deeper neurological events that actually do the healing. Resolving this determines the entire future of psychedelic medicine. Whether the subjective experience is an undesirable side effect or the primary mechanism of action dictates how the biopharmaceutical industry will engineer new drugs and how healthcare systems will design clinical treatments. If the altered state of consciousness is just a byproduct, pharmaceutical engineers can design it out. Investigators are currently synthesizing compounds called psychoplastogens, molecules that retain 5-HT2A activation but completely lack hallucinogenic activity. This diagram illustrates the psychoplastogenicity model. It posits that classic psychedelics induce measurable, rapid structural changes, neuroplasticity, within the prefrontal cortex at the neuronal level following a single administration. By promoting physical dendritic spine growth and correcting abnormal neural circuitry, this model argues that structural change is the sole therapeutic driver. Any elicited subjective experience is neurologically irrelevant to the clinical outcome. The motivations behind this model are highly practical. Standard psychedelic sessions are immensely resource-intensive, requiring specialized physical environments and trained psychological monitors. Current clinical protocols mandate multi-hour supervision to manage the acute subjective effects, which drives up costs and severely limits scalability. Furthermore, the intensity of these effects requires the strict exclusion of certain at-risk patient groups. If the epiphenomenon hypothesis is accurate, psychoplastogens will render classic psychedelics obsolete by offering the same structural brain benefits without the operational overhead. To test this assumption, we have to look closely at the clinical data. A 2025 meta-analysis by Romeo et al. Systematically aggregated outcomes across multiple clinical trials to test the relationship between subjective intensity and clinical results. Researchers quantify these deeply subjective states using standardized psychometric instruments, most commonly the Mystical Experience Questionnaire, or MEQ, and the 11D Altered States of Consciousness scale. These tools measure variables like oceanic boundlessness, ego dissolution, and ineffability. This data visualization shows the meta-analyse's primary finding: a reliable global positive association between psychedelic intensity and clinical improvement at a 0.33 correlation coefficient. Subgroups reveal stronger links: 0.41 for mood disorders and 0.19 for addictions. The positive relationship holds across diagnostic boundaries. This quantitative data is corroborated by a 2022 systematic review by Ko et al., which looked specifically at the therapeutic efficacy of mystical experiences. Analyzing 12 clinical studies utilizing psilocybin, ayahuasca, or ketamine, 10 studies provided distinct evidence linking mystical experiences directly to symptom reduction. This quantitative consensus contradicts the core premise of the psychoplastogen hypothesis. The data indicates that the subjective intensity of the experience reliably predicts clinical improvement. Treating the entire trip as a single monolithic variable obscures the actual mechanics at play. We must identify exactly which aspects of the acute subjective effect correlate with positive outcomes. This grid, recreating Table 1 from Kangas Lampe's 2023 review, maps experiential features under psychedelics against mental health improvements. Mystical type experiences strongly correlate with positive changes in well-being and anxiety reduction. However, several null findings indicate mystical unity alone doesn't guarantee long-term symptom reduction for depression. This reveals a crucial divergence in the data. the difference between experiencing mystical transcendence and achieving concrete psychological insights. Multiple large survey datasets indicate that psychological insights and emotional breakthroughs are often stronger predictors for reductions in depression and anxiety than feelings of oceanic boundlessness. Different symptoms require different cognitive breakthroughs. This points to the subjective state functioning as an active mechanism in the recovery process, rather than a secondary byproduct of neural firing. The clinical consequence of this data is clear. Because the acute subjective effect is a causal mediator of recovery, administering pharmacology alone is insufficient. This is why clinical models rely heavily on set and setting. Practitioners must rigorously optimize the patient's physical and mental environment to facilitate the specific phenomenological states that drive efficacy. Based on Aldridge's framework, this flowchart maps how subjective states translate to clinical utility, centering on a non-ordinary state of consciousness. This requires 3 prefactors: invitation, context, and individual aptitude. Trials manipulate these, curating aesthetics, music, and guides to maximize a high-intensity mystical score. The environmental and psychotherapeutic container is load-bearing. It is tied directly to the pharmacological action of classic psychedelics. Simply experiencing a non-ordinary state of consciousness, however profound, does not automatically confer permanent behavioral change. The acute phase has severe limitations if left isolated. To cross from acute experience to long-term resolution requires a critical bottleneck: integration. Here, abstract insights and emotional breakthroughs consolidate into stable cognitive patterns. The psychedelic state merely provides a temporary window of neuroplasticity. The actual therapeutic labor occurs as patients apply these insights daily. When we revisit the psychoplastogen hypothesis in light of this operational framework, the risks become apparent. Attempting to bypass the subjective experience and the subsequent psychological work risks forfeiting the deep cognitive reframing required to treat complex psychiatric disorders. While non-hallucinogenic compounds may hold future promise for specific neurodegenerative applications, the current empirical data indicates that for classic psychedelics, the intensity, content, and integration of the subjective trip represent the primary driver of therapeutic efficacy.